In January 2013, the body of 42-year-old Clint Harrington was discovered in the grand hallway of his mansion in Highland Ridge, an affluent neighborhood in Dallas, Texas. The investigation that followed unraveled a twisted web of betrayal, obsession, and greed. It began months earlier, in fall 2012, when Melissa Harrington, Clint's glamorous wife of 15 years, crossed paths with their enigmatic neighbor, Jack Burnett. The series of events that followed would shatter the facade of their perfect life and culminate in a shocking crime that left the community reeling. In the early hours of January 1st, 2013, at exactly 3:14 a.m., a chilling 911 call pierced the quiet night of Dallas's affluent Highland Ridge neighborhood. Melissa Harrington, the caller, was frantic, her voice trembling and breaking as she described what she claimed was a terrible accident. She told the dispatcher her husband, Clint Harrington, was on the floor and bleeding, but the full weight of what she was saying didn't hit until first responders arrived at the Harrington estate. The Harrington mansion, an elegant symbol of wealth and status, was eerily quiet when the police pulled into the driveway, its towering windows reflecting the faint glow of the post-party fireworks still lighting the distant horizon. Inside, the scene was one of stark contrast. Lavish remnants of a grand New Year's Eve celebration cluttered the space. Half-empty champagne glasses, crushed confetti underfoot, and expensive hors d'oeuvres untouched on silver trays. Yet, in the middle of this extravagance, the gruesome reality of death took center stage. Clint's body lay sprawled in the marble-tiled hallway, the front of his designer tuxedo stained deep red from a single gunshot wound to the chest. Beside him on the floor was a silver revolver, its polished surface glinting under the flickering chandelier light. The chaos of the hallway suggested a struggle. Overturned furniture, a shattered champagne flute near Clint's hand, and faint scuff marks that indicated movement leading up to the moment the gun went off. Detectives arriving at the scene could not ignore the sharp juxtaposition, the beauty of the celebration and the ugliness of its aftermath. Melissa, still wearing her shimmering evening gown, was seated in the corner of the living room when the police found her. She looked disheveled, her makeup smudged from tears that hadn't stopped since her frantic call. Witnesses later said she was shaking uncontrollably, clutching a glass of water that one of the officers had handed her. Though Melissa repeatedly insisted it had been an accident, her vague answers and inability to recall the exact events of the night raised immediate red flags. The investigation began almost as soon as Clint's body was removed from the house. Detectives took their first steps into reconstructing the timeline of the party. A grand, meticulously planned event that had been the talk of the neighborhood for weeks. Clint had invited over 50 guests, including friends, business associates, and the neighbors. By all accounts, the Harringtons had appeared to be the perfect hosts, their outward smiles betraying no sign of what would come. One guest stood out almost immediately: Jack Burnett, a charming but divisive figure who had only recently moved into the neighborhood. Jack had attended the party alone, and though his invitation had been extended as a polite gesture, Clint was reportedly uneasy about his presence. A successful businessman and fiercely protective of his reputation, Clint was said to have clashed with Jack in the past over petty neighborhood disagreements. To some, Jack was a harmless flirt and socialite, but to Clint, he was trouble waiting to happen. By January 2nd, 2013, investigators had begun piecing together accounts from the night of the party. Witnesses spoke of a rising tension that had overshadowed the festivities. Many remembered Clint growing visibly agitated as the night wore on. Several guests recalled hearing raised voices coming from the study, where Clint, Melissa, and Jack were briefly seen together. Though the exact words exchanged weren't clear, one thing was certain. Clint and Jack had argued, and Melissa had been caught in the middle. Surveillance footage from the Harrington estate provided investigators with additional context. By January 5, 2013, detectives reviewed clips that showed Clint and Jack standing on the back patio shortly after midnight, their body language suggesting a confrontation. Melissa joined them soon after, her hurried movements and frantic gestures indicating that she was trying to de-escalate the situation. Minutes later, all three were seen walking back into the house. That was the last time Clint was captured alive on camera. Melissa Harrington's behavior in the days following the murder only deepened suspicions. On January 8, 2013, police brought her in for questioning. From the start, it was clear that Melissa was struggling to hold herself together. She appeared disoriented, repeatedly contradicting herself when asked about the sequence of events leading up to Clint's death. At times, she claimed she hadn't seen Clint and Jack arguing, then moments later admitted she had tried to break up their fight. Her erratic responses were coupled with a defensive attitude whenever detectives pressed her on her relationship with Jack Burnett. Though Melissa insisted the shooting had been accidental, perhaps a misfire during a struggle for the gun, her account lacked crucial details. Why had the gun even been drawn in the first place? And why had no one else at the party heard the altercation? Neighbors who stayed late at the party mentioned Melissa disappearing for stretches of time, her whereabouts unclear in the lead-up to Clint's death. By now, media outlets had caught wind of the case, and theories began swirling. Reporters speculated about Clint's business dealings and whether the murder might have been related to his cutthroat reputation. Others hinted at the Harringtons' troubled marriage, suggesting that jealousy, greed, or betrayal could have been a motive. But most pointed their fingers at the enigmatic Jack Burnett, whose name seemed to come up in every retelling of the night's events. The investigation had only just begun, yet the pieces were already falling into place: a shattered marriage, an uninvited guest, and a gunshot that ended one life while unraveling the lives of everyone connected to it. Fall 2012 marked a significant shift in Melissa Harrington's otherwise carefully constructed life. She had spent 15 years as the perfect trophy wife, married to Clint Harrington, a man who could effortlessly command attention in any room with his sharp wit and undeniable charisma. Clint was the embodiment of Texan wealth and power, his fortune built on decades of ruthless success in the oil industry. But Clint's charm came with a dark side. He was a man who valued control above all else, control of his empire, his image, and his wife. Melissa, though glamorous and admired, often felt like an accessory to Clint's success rather than a partner in their marriage. When Melissa first met Jack Burnett at a neighborhood BBQ in late September 2012, she had no idea how much her life was about to change. Jack was different from the other men in Highland Ridge. While Clint's wealth was overt and commanding, Jack's appeal lay in his mystery. A relative newcomer to the gated community, Jack had a way of making everyone feel like the center of his attention, and Melissa was no exception. Over grilled steaks and casual small talk, he showered her with compliments that felt intoxicating after years of Clint's indifference. His flattery was subtle, yet persistent, and for Melissa, it was a stark reminder of the passion her marriage lacked. Over the following weeks, their encounters became more frequent. Jack always seemed to be nearby, whether jogging past her house or coincidentally running into her at the upscale market where she shopped. By October, their chemistry had become undeniable. They began meeting in secret, their rendezvous taking place at quiet motels or secluded spots outside the prying eyes of the neighborhood. For Melissa, these moments with Jack were a dangerous escape from the suffocating grip of Clint's control. But Jack, while charming, soon began to reveal unsettling traits. His attentiveness turned possessive, his flirtation evolving into subtle threats whenever Melissa tried to create distance. Still, her need for freedom and validation kept her tethered to the affair. As the year drew to a close, Clint unknowingly orchestrated the stage for the unraveling of his own life. On December 31st, 2012, he hosted one of his legendary New Year's Eve parties, a dazzling affair designed to showcase his dominance in both business and social circles. The Harrington estate was transformed into a scene straight out of a luxury magazine, complete with glittering lights, a live jazz band, and the finest champagne money could buy. Melissa played her role as the gracious hostess perfectly, moving through the crowd with poise, greeting every guest with a warm smile that masked the storm brewing beneath the surface. Jack was not on the guest list. Clint had explicitly avoided inviting him, though Melissa suspected it had more to do with Clint's lingering unease about Jack's reputation than any knowledge of their affair. But Jack was never one to be deterred by social barriers. As the evening unfolded, he arrived unannounced, dressed impeccably, and armed with his trademark charm. He brushed off the raised eyebrows of the guests, claiming he couldn't miss the best party in town. Melissa's heart sank the moment she saw him walk through the grand entryway. She had begged him to stay away, warning him that Clint's temper was easily provoked, but Jack's expression made it clear that he had no intention of staying on the sidelines. Throughout the night, Jack lingered in the shadows, his eyes following Melissa with an intensity that made her increasingly uneasy. Clint, ever perceptive, began to notice Jack's presence. By 11 p.m., the tension in the air was palpable. Guests whispered among themselves, exchanging knowing glances as Clint's mood visibly darkened. At 11:30 p.m., the thin veneer of civility finally cracked. Witnesses later recalled seeing Clint confront Jack in the study, a richly decorated room filled with dark leather furniture and Clint's collection of vintage whiskey. The argument that followed was muffled by the thick oak doors, but the raised voices carried enough for guests in the hallway to pick up fragments of the conversation. Clint accused Jack of crossing boundaries, while Jack's responses, though quieter, were sharp and taunting. Melissa was seen rushing toward the study, her movements frantic as she pushed her way inside, closing the door behind her. No one could say for sure what happened during those tense minutes in the study, but by the time the three of them emerged, the atmosphere had shifted. Clint's face was flushed with anger, and Melissa looked as though she might burst into tears. Jack, however, wore a calm, almost smug expression that seemed to taunt Clint further. The three of them separated, but the damage was done. Clint's need for control had been challenged in front of his peers, and Melissa's carefully maintained facade was beginning to crumble. As midnight approached, the partygoers gathered outside to watch the fireworks display that Clint had arranged as the grand finale. But Melissa and Clint were notably absent. Witnesses last saw the couple near the main hallway, their body language tense and confrontational. Melissa's gestures were animated, as though she were pleading with Clint to calm down, while Clint's posture was rigid, his anger barely contained. At the same time, Jack lingered nearby, watching the exchange with an unreadable expression. When the clock struck 12, the night erupted in a symphony of fireworks and cheers. Yet inside the Harrington estate, the celebration took a dark and irreversible turn. A single gunshot shattered the moment, its sharp crack cutting through the music and laughter like a knife. Guests froze, their faces turning toward the house in confusion and fear. Moments later, Melissa stumbled into the living room, her face pale and her hands trembling. The partygoers quickly realized that the source of the gunshot had been no celebratory firework. By the time the first responders arrived, the party had descended into chaos. Guests whispered in hushed tones, speculating about what had just happened. Some rushed to leave, eager to distance themselves from the unfolding scandal, while others stayed behind, their morbid curiosity keeping them rooted in place. Outside, the fireworks continued to explode, painting the night sky with brilliant colors that felt almost mocking against the grim scene inside. December 31st, 2012, would be a night that no one in Highland Ridge would ever forget. The investigation into Clint Harrington's death quickly became the talk of Highland Ridge. The whispers of betrayal, jealousy, and manipulation only intensified as the police began to piece together the puzzle of what happened that fateful New Year's Eve. By January 2nd, 2013, detectives had collected initial forensic evidence, witness statements, and fragments of a story that seemed to shift depending on who was telling it. The case was anything but simple. Detective Carla Ramos, a seasoned investigator known for her meticulous nature, immediately recognized that this was no random act of violence. The scene spoke of raw emotions, the kind that boiled over into chaos. The gun, a silver revolver, was the first clue. It had been left near Clint's body, smeared with blood and fingerprints. Forensics revealed 2 sets of prints on the weapon. Melissa's, expected given her claim that she had tried to take the gun from Clint during an argument, and another partial print belonging to Jack Burnett. This single piece of evidence placed Jack at the heart of the crime scene, but it also raised a critical question. Why had Jack been near the gun? Gunpowder residue was found on Melissa's hands, and though she insisted it was from her attempt to wrestle the weapon away from Clint, the presence of residue suggested she had been closer to the gun when it fired than she admitted. Adding to the suspicion were the bruises discovered on Clint's arms during the autopsy. They hinted at a struggle, further complicating Melissa's version of events. Was Clint trying to defend himself, or was Melissa desperately trying to stop him from using the gun? Detective Ramos couldn't ignore the physical evidence, but it didn't provide all the answers. As Ramos and her team began questioning witnesses, the story became even murkier. Melissa's best friend, Sandra Taylor, reluctantly stepped forward. Sandra had known Melissa for years and had always been a quiet observer of the Harringtons' marriage. She revealed that just weeks before the party, Melissa had confided in her about the affair with Jack. According to Sandra, Melissa had admitted she was deeply unhappy in her marriage, but also terrified of Jack's increasingly possessive behavior. Melissa had mentioned wanting to end the affair, but feared Jack's reaction, especially after he had made veiled threats about not letting her go. Sandra's testimony painted Melissa as a woman trapped in a volatile situation, but it also raised questions about her true intentions. Other guests at the party provided conflicting accounts. Several described Jack as erratic and unhinged, noting how he had seemed fixated on Melissa throughout the evening. One guest even recalled seeing Jack watching Clint and Melissa from the shadows, his expression unreadable but intense. However, other accounts highlighted Clint's aggressive behavior toward Melissa. Witnesses described moments when Clint had grabbed Melissa's arm tightly, his frustrations spilling over in ways that made people uncomfortable. These details suggested that the tension at the party had been building long before the fatal shot was fired. Detective Ramos couldn't ignore Melissa's behavior during questioning. Her tears flowed freely, and her voice often broke when recounting the night's events, but there was something about her demeanor that felt off. Ramos noticed how Melissa's story seemed rehearsed, her words carefully chosen, as if she were trying to steer the narrative. Beneath the grief, there was a subtle mix of fear and guilt that Ramos couldn't quite place. It was clear Melissa was hiding something, but whether it was to protect herself, Jack, or even Clint's memory was unclear. Jack's interview only added to the complexity of the case. When brought in for questioning, he maintained a calm, almost defiant attitude. He denied any involvement in the murder, but made no effort to hide his feelings for Melissa. Jack admitted he was in love with her and claimed he had only gone to the party to ensure she was safe. His insistence that he hadn't pulled the trigger clashed with his inability to explain how his fingerprint ended up on the gun. The more Ramos pressed, the more Jack's calm facade began to crack, revealing a man who seemed as desperate as Melissa to control the story. The investigation took a sharp turn on January 15, 2013, when an anonymous letter arrived at the police station. It was neatly typed, with no indication of its sender, but its contents sent shockwaves through the case. The letter accused Melissa of orchestrating Clint's murder, claiming she had grown tired of her controlling husband and wanted to start a new life with Jack. It detailed Melissa's alleged manipulation, suggesting she had lured Clint into an argument to create the perfect storm for his demise. The letter also hinted at a financial motive, which detectives soon uncovered. Clint's will had been updated just weeks before his death, leaving his entire estate to Melissa. The timing of the change coincided with reports of Melissa threatening to leave Clint, a move that could have left her with nothing. This revelation painted Melissa in a new light. Was she a victim? Or was she playing both sides, using Jack as a pawn in her plan to escape a loveless marriage and secure her future? The final blow to the fragile story came on January 20th, 2013, when Jack confessed to being at the scene during the shooting. His confession was reluctant, almost tortured, as if he were grappling with the weight of his own involvement. He claimed that Melissa had pulled the trigger in a moment of rage, a claim that directly contradicted her insistence that Clint had been the aggressor. Jack's confession was both damning and incomplete. While it placed Melissa squarely at the center of the crime, it also raised new questions about Jack's role. Was he simply a witness? Or had he played a more active part in the events leading up to Clint's death? By the end of January, the investigation had unraveled a web of lies, manipulation, and desperation that left even the most seasoned detectives stunned. Each piece of evidence and every conflicting testimony painted a picture of three lives colliding in a way that could only end in tragedy. But despite the mounting evidence, the truth remained elusive, buried beneath layers of deceit and raw emotion. As the case moved closer to trial, one thing was certain: the story of Clint Harrington's death was far from over. The trial of Melissa Harrington began on a cold morning in March 2013, a date that had been circled on every calendar in Highland Ridge. The courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as people from the community gathered to hear the details of a case that had shaken their once peaceful neighborhood to its core. Melissa, dressed in a conservative black suit, appeared pale and gaunt, her once glamorous aura dulled by months of stress. Jack Burnett sat at a distance, his own trial pending, but his fate already intertwined with hers. From the very beginning, Melissa's defense took a bold approach. They portrayed Clint as a controlling, abusive husband, a man whose relentless need for power had driven Melissa into a corner. They argued that the events of New Year's Eve were the culmination of years of fear and repression. According to the defense, Melissa had acted in self-defense during a heated argument that spiraled out of control. Clint's bruises, they suggested, were signs of a physical altercation that Melissa had desperately tried to escape. But the prosecution was prepared to dismantle that narrative. Midway through the trial, they introduced a shocking piece of evidence: that turned the courtroom on its head. A voicemail left by Clint for Sandra Taylor just hours before the party. In the recording, Clint's voice, strained but steady, warned Sandra about Jack Burnett. He described Jack as dangerous and accused him of manipulating Melissa into a destructive path. This voicemail changed everything. It painted Clint not as an aggressor, but as a man trying to protect his wife from a situation spiraling beyond his control. The revelation cast a harsh spotlight on Sandra Taylor, whose presence in the courtroom suddenly felt heavy with implication. It was during cross-examination that Sandra's role in the tragedy became chillingly clear. Melissa had confided in her closest friend about her affair with Jack and her growing desperation to leave Clint. But Sandra, instead of offering support, had betrayed her. Jealous of Melissa's seemingly perfect life, and perhaps driven by her own hidden frustrations, Sandra had tipped off Clint about the affair. What she didn't anticipate was the cascade of events her meddling would set into motion. As the courtroom absorbed this twist, the focus shifted once more to Melissa. The defense's argument that she was a victim of circumstance began to crumble. The prosecution now painted a more complex picture. Melissa, as a woman who had played with fire, orchestrating an escape that involved both manipulation and betrayal. Clint's voicemail became a haunting echo of a man who had seen the danger coming, but was powerless to stop it. By the end of the trial, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before delivering their verdict. On a somber April afternoon, Melissa Harrington was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Jack Burnett, implicated as an accessory, was later sentenced to 10 years, his role in the tragedy seen as secondary but significant. Sandra Taylor, though not charged, became a pariah in the community, her betrayal leaving a stain that no one could overlook. The scandal left Highland Ridge forever changed. Neighbors who once admired the Harringtons' wealth and glamour now viewed their story as a cautionary tale of how passion, greed, and betrayal could unravel even the most carefully curated lives. As Melissa was led away in handcuffs, her face void of emotion, it was clear that the events of that New Year's Eve had destroyed not just one life, but many. And for the community, the lingering question was not just who was guilty, but how so